Technology can improve or undermine democracy depending on how it is used and who controls it. Right now, it is controlled by too few. The collection of vast amount of information about user preferences combined with the use of very targeted behavioral techniques enable the manipulation of citizens' choices. Persuasive technologies are capable of refining and shaping public opinion with a reach and power that has never been seen before. But how can democratic institutions counter this dynamic? What is the future of democracy in the digital age? To discuss the future of democracy in the digital age, I'm joined by Ike Picone, who is Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Communication Sciences at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. I'm Kiorri, and this is Communicating Democracy, the EuroPCom podcast on public communication. So, Ike, how can digital technologies be regulated to better serve people and communities while strengthening democracies in the digital age?
That's quite a question, but let's start to unpack it maybe and see how we can try to come to an answer. I think it's important to see, first of all, technology as something that is continuously changing, so that we need to also look at our regulation. Sometimes the idea is that technology moves so fast that regulation is bound to be coming late to the party. But that's just a reality we need to face, and I think it should not discourage us to move forward. Second is that we should also look at technology as something that is not per se neutral, in the sense that there are certain prerogatives, there are certain companies, certain interests behind this technology. And so regulation of technology also becomes a regulation of those interests. And in doing that, we need to strike a fair balance between the innovative capacities that the technology has and what it could bring forward that is good to society. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we foster the technology in a way that is good for our democracy and not only good for the people or the interests behind it. And making that difference between the interests and the actual technology, I think, remains an important way forward when we look at democracy and technology.
Mm-hmm. So then, should AI technologies be integrated into public infrastructure to ensure democratic control? And how can we start a broader conversation about publicly owned tech that aligns with democratic values?
That's an interesting perspective that we now need to consider a bit more, I think, than we used to do before, because I think the European Union, as a policymaker, has seen also technology for a long time as something that was going to be pro-democracy or good for democracy per definition. Mm-hmm. And this has made for a kind of vacuum in the regulation, or let's say a regulation that was fostering technology. So the whole idea of, for example, the Web 2.0 a few years ago, or the idea of social media, was also positioned as a democratic force for good. So more people were able to participate with the technology, to the public debate, to public life, to also our political life. And slowly, this kind of optimism has started to make place for a more negative or way of looking at technologies, realizing that, for example, that same technology that could spread voices of progressive politics, let's say, could also be used to spread voices of anti-democratic rhetorics.
Right.
And I think that has put the EU a bit in an awkward position, let's say. So what do we do now? Because indeed, to a certain extent, we might need to regulate technology, but more precisely, we might need to regulate certain parts of free speech because if they are amplified by technology, that specific characteristics, we end up with something we don't want. But how do we do that while keeping respect for these core values that have been driven EU policymaking for decades? And I think there it's one way of doing that is also to reassess some of these basic principles.
Right. But, the EU, okay, it is regulating, but how can the EU, but also national states, because they also regulate on their own, in what way can they ensure democratic balance when it comes to the protection of ethical values like autonomy, justice, and equality with the rapid pace that the technology is advancing right now?
Well, you can do so by thinking about it in terms that are more democratic. Let's say you can think about technology as a service that is offered by a company. You can also think about technology as an infrastructure that helps bring about certain services of public value. If you look at technology like that, you could also think whether leaving that kind of fundamentally important service over to private media is the right way forward. And I think if you talk about making our technology democracy-proof, I also think you need to think in terms of how to make it much more publicly funded, public-oriented. See, for example, what happened with the public service media. At some point, as a democracy, you say, well, information is so important that we need, next to potentially very interesting and relevant commercial enterprises providing that service, also at least a publicly funded public service media that are able to make sure that this service is provided at without needing to abide to market principles.
Right. So I understand what you're saying, but the problem that we have at hand right now is that only few corporations are the ones controlling the most technological advancements, right? So how can you ensure and how can you address the growing influence of these tech corporations and the manipulation of the public opinion through algorithms and social media to protect democratic institutions and to ensure technology serves the common good?
You can do so by making the scope and the dynamics of an organization grafted on public value and not on commercial value.
Right.
So that means concretely, Facebook has an algorithm which it put a lot of energy in perfectioning to make sure that it brings about as much advertising revenue as possible. You can very much make an algorithm that has a not completely different scope. Like how do you show people as many different point of view as there are possible? And you can start filtering content based on that. That is a choice, I think, that you need to make, and that you could say, well, if we operate a public service social medium, then we could make that service work that way. I don't say that it has to be per se a public service medium. It could also be that we regulate the existing ones in a way that we force them to also take these kind of algorithmic differences into account. For now, I feel that they have withheld any kind of sharing of information on the algorithms, refused to do to be also open about the data they collect through those algorithms. So I'm just a bit skeptical there. I think that they are not per se willing to do much about that, which brings me a bit closer to, well, we have public service media. Is there maybe, or could we start thinking, not saying we have to do it immediately, but could we start thinking in that direction to find answers?
Now, this is also very nice points that you're making, but how can publicly funded innovation and coherent regulation be designed to protect public interest, safeguard privacy as a collective right, and support civil society organizations in the digital age? How can this be achieved?
I think you can also build the creation of, for example, such an algorithm or such a platform by using democratic processes such as co-creation, participation, trying to make sure that you also involve a lot of stakeholders in deciding what is privacy or not, or privacy respecting or not. We have these movements called like ethics by design or privacy by design, where you really try to think from the very beginning of how could this algorithm or this service help to foster these democratic values, which is definitely not what was in the minds of the people developing the social media platforms that we have at hand now. So I think there are ways of including various perspectives from the onset.
I'll take you a little bit back to our conversation. You talked about EU funding, right? So in what ways can the EU's funding approach be adjusted to prioritize creative formats for media literacy and fact-checking rather than focusing solely on technological innovation? Because that is also very important. You said earlier that technology has also been used to spread certain kind of opinions that are not always the most ethical ones. So what can be done?
I think when you look at the innovation policies of the EU, that in theory, in principle, they are already demanding that there is enough attention to the user side, for example, or that ethical perspectives are incorporated in the innovation process. So I think in theory, we are already on a good path there. Maybe in the execution of it, you sometimes see that this kind of innovation takes a bit more time, takes a bit more policy also in terms of getting people on the same page.
Right.
It's difficult to talk between disciplines, so it all goes a little bit slower. But I think we are there, that there are policies. Maybe one point I would make there is that what I sometimes seem to lack a little bit is the realization that innovation in a media perspective is not per se always so focused on getting a technological innovation as such, but to getting technologies to work in innovative ways. And so, for example, when we talk about AI, I feel that the discussion is now going towards we need our own large language models at the European level, but also at the Belgian level, or because we have different languages, we need that. It could be that this is an interesting and valuable way forward, but from a media perspective, you could already start innovating also at a much more concrete scale with existing small-scale AIs, just trying to make, for example, new formats that are personalized. I don't think you per se need an whole new AI to do that. You can use existing ones, even ones that are building already in Europe.
And in Europe, do you think we're there yet, or are we lagging behind? Because we hear a lot of conversation about how Europe is lagging behind in this field. Do you think we're moving towards the right direction, and what would be the right direction as well?
I don't think we are per se lagging behind. I think we need to be careful with that rhetoric, because it will make us at some point choose for competition rather than, for example, values. And if we do that, then we can go back to the initial points of our discussion. That's what Facebook and Meta and the others are doing, to build a new technology that is not based on these principles. If we want to differentiate ourselves, if we want to stay true also to these democratic principles, I think it's important to prioritize also these fundamental values. And it's true. That's why our American colleagues are a bit upset, because that means that when they come offer their services here, they need to take into consideration that we don't like disinformation on our platforms. We don't like privacy being put in the streets and everyone can just use it. We have some safeguards. And some, maybe it's a bit more, let's say, ideological or utopian, but I do still think that if we want to move forward as Europe, also in technology and innovation, we should stick to that. We should stick to prioritizing these ideals. That doesn't mean that you cannot have some constructive criticism on how the EU is doing that. Maybe one thing is that if you spread your money across a whole slate of different programs and a whole slate of different topics, that maybe that is also something where the idea behind it is good, because it gives a lot of different organizations and different perspectives the possibility to flourish or to make their technological project. On the other hand, maybe you need to choose a little bit what are like the key elements, the key technologies that we want to focus on, and where we might maybe in the next years spend a bit more attention to or prioritize over some of the other ones. And so a bit of a reflection on what the big missions are.
Right. And now the €1 million question. What is the future of democracy in the digital age? How would you envision it?
I would envision it as the democracy that we have now, but then even better. I think there it's all about the values that we hold dear, and also the principles that we have ingrained in the way we work and in the way we live with each other and the way we interact with each other. It's true that digital era has specificities that challenge these. It is indeed more difficult to organize a public debate when you don't have gatekeepers, when everyone is just able to put their information out there. But it means that we have to work with that. And so maybe at some point a part of media literacy also becomes media decency. How do you engage with each other online, and how do you do so in a civilized, democratically valuable way?
Ike, thank you very much for joining me on this episode. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Communicating Democracy. And if you want to discover more about the link between democracy and technology, check out our EuroPCom podcast series. And of course, if you like this episode, feel free to share it with your network. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time. This is a podcast series of the European Committee of the Regions. For more information on EuroPCom, please visit the website co.europa.eu.